Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Book Festival. We're pleased today to present this program together with the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction. The authors have a great conversation planned, and we ask you to please support them by purchasing their books. There's a button below. Enjoy the program, and thank you.
Hello, and welcome to this year's Brooklyn Book Festival. My name is Myriam Francois. I'm a journalist and writer, and I'm your host for today's panel entitled True Crime, New Perspectives. I was a judge on last year's Baillie Gifford Prize, and so I had the immense pleasure of reading the two incredible books, which will be at the centre, no doubt, of much of today's conversation. Just a heads up to let you know that this year's Baillie Gifford Prize is in full swing, with the shortlist being announced on October 15th and the winner on November 24th. And for the non-fiction fans, the Read Smart podcast is available now on Spotify, iTunes, Entail and Stitcher. Now, today's panel will be approximately 30 to 40 minutes of interview, followed by a 15 to 20-minute Q&A session, which relies on you sharing the questions, the burning questions, which I'm sure you would love to put to our speakers. So please get involved in that chat and let us know what you want answers to. And I'll try and get to as many of those as possible. Now, today, Hallie Rubenhold, the Baillie Gifford Prize winner, chronicler of the victims of Jack the Ripper, and Casey Cep, whose book on the courtroom drama of a 1970s serial killer, Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee, which was also shortlisted for the prize last year, will discuss their books and how the genre of true crime does not have to be sensationalist and can uncover hidden lives. So without further ado, let me introduce to you our two speakers. Casey Cep is a staff writer at The New Yorker. After graduating from Harvard with a degree in English, she earned an MPhil in theology at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. She lives with her family on the eastern shore of Maryland. Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee is her first book. Hallie Rubenhold is a social historian and an authority on women's lives in the past. She's worked as a curator for the National Portrait Gallery and as a university lecturer. Her books include Lady Worsley's Whim, dramatised by the BBC as The Scandalous Lady W, and Covent Garden Ladies, The Extraordinary Stories of Harris's List, which inspired the ITV series Harlots. I apparently have to add in that she lives in London with her husband. Welcome to you both. Thank you, Hallie and Casey, for joining us. First off, I'm guessing this hasn't been your typical year as an author who both of you have published these books with an incredible reception. So what's it been like since the books have come out, and what's it been in this new normal for you to promote it and get out there and share the word?
Well, Casey, do you want to speak first?
Sure. That's kind of the offer. I mean, the truth is it's I'm sure, like it is for everyone, just a bit surreal. I mean, last year I met Hallie and we were all together for the prize, and it was typical London evenings in the fall. We went to bookshops, we met with people who'd read them, we fielded audience questions. It's nice to feel like there's a virtual substitute for that now, and I'm very grateful to be here today and to have been able to do these kinds of events remotely. It does feel like a dangerous time for people, and I'm certainly grateful to be able to keep doing my work safely and remotely, and I hope that's true for all the folks with us today. And it's nice to see Hallie's face again, even though we are only on the computer.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And I echo very much what you were saying about last year and how exciting it was, and how we met each other, and then suddenly the world changed, and that was quite a shock for me. I mean, to be going to places like Jaipur, the Jaipur Literary Festival, and then Abu Dhabi, and then suddenly the world shut down. And all of the promotion that I was doing and all the work I was doing was actually from the room I'm sitting in now. And so that it was quite a shock to the system. But I think also moving on to the next book that I'm going to be writing, which also is true crime, finding that the archives are closed. And when you want to get into the archives, you have to put your name on a waiting list and wait days and days, which when you're in the research phase of writing is incredibly frustrating, because it's very difficult to consolidate your ideas when you can only go into an archive for a short amount of time and photograph everything you possibly can, take it away, and then you're not allowed back in for weeks at a time, if not months. So I have to say, it's been an enormously frustrating time for me.
I can only imagine. And I suppose it's probably for a lot of people who were really looking forward to coming and engaging with you both in person about your book. So hopefully we can get a little bit of that engagement going today. My first question to you both is, why did you choose to write about true crime? And did you set out with a clear intention to approach these stories from an alternative angle, however you might define it? I suppose if Casey kicked off, Hallie, do you want to kick off on this one?
No, let Casey speak first.
Casey, I don't know if you're feeling.
We must remind folks that Hallie did win the prize last year. She is the prize-winning author of this panel, and so she not only needs to answer that question, but she's teased us with the subject of her next book, which I'm so curious. I don't know if you've made it public yet or not, Hallie, but you start this one.
Oh, I have. And so, well, my next book is actually going to be about the murder of Belle Elmore by Dr. Crippen in 1910, which is what for American readers, I'm calling the most famous American murder story you have never heard of, because both Dr. Crippen and Belle Elmore were Americans living in London in 1910. And I'm looking at this through, very similarly to what I've done with the five, through the women's perspectives, and looking at this story. I know this isn't the question I'm meant to be asking, but I think it's kind of,
please go ahead. Yeah.
It's organically moving in this direction. So obviously what I did with the five was to look at the lives of the five victims and to look at them exclusively and to remove them from the context of the murder, because often when we think of Jack the Ripper, we think of, it's a whodunit story and the murderer was never caught, and it's all about that, and it's all about the policing, and it's all about the hunt for the killer and all sorts of speculation around it. And in the midst of all of this, what gets lost is that this is actually also a story of five human beings whose lives and experiences have been completely overlooked. And by looking at these five lives, we can get a very strong sense of what it was like being a woman in the 19th century, what it was like being part of the underclass. And if you connect that, effectively that half of the story onto the Jack the Ripper narrative, it completely changes the focus. It completely changes how we see this. I mean, especially in Britain, this very important, I hate to say cultural myth, but it has become very much part of our culture. And it's something that's like something that we export as well to the rest of the world. The rest of the world knows Britain because of things like Agatha Christie, Downton Abbey, Henry VIII, Jack the Ripper. People come to London for that. And this is a story of a murderer, a story of a real man who killed real women. And so it was very important to tell those stories. Similarly, what I'm writing about with my next book is looking at, if we are to take Dr. Crippen out of the center of this story, what can we learn about the life and times of these women, and about how we tell, what are traditional ways of telling the true crime narrative that we can change. So I'm telling the story backwards. I'm telling it through the women's perspectives. And there's so much to come out of that. And I think, creating new pathways into exploring the significance of a murder, I think is very important, because we're very much stuck in this one note type of way of looking at a murder, which is as a whodunit. And we can dissect a murder and find so much more rich material within that dissection. And I think Casey probably has quite a lot to say about that on that point.
Yeah, I mean, Casey, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, sure. I agree with a great deal of what Hallie said about the kind of cultural expectations we bring to these stories and the appetites that they nurture and the kind of lurid tourism they might generate. And I think that when I started my book, I was incredibly aware of those and incredibly nervous about them, and thought a great deal about how not to participate in those tropes. And I know we're going to talk about some of the conventions of true crime, but I think Hallie and I had the same idea from the start, which is the center of this story can't be the violence at the heart of it. You know, that has always been the core of how the story was told. And I came to my book through Harper Lee, through the kind of literary biography side, and I was interested in the legal and political aspects of the story and some of the characters. And so I felt like even in the structure of the book, one of the things I did was make sure that the murders themselves would not be the majority of the book, that there would be these other characters to build around. And, you know, I think Hallie is very smart on sociology and the way that we should be broadening our lens on culture and thinking critically about received history and received mythologies. And so I think that's all part of how I approached my book too. And I'm grateful that that's the starting point for our conversation, because I do think the responsibility of a writer in these times, especially with marginal lives or misrepresented histories, to really look for accuracy and fact, and to be forthright about when you found it and when you haven't, or the challenges of finding your way to it. So I certainly did not set out to write a true crime book, even though there's crime in the story.
So can I just, presumably, you know, you said you started out with a similar intention, but you weren't in conversation about this need to sort of come at these stories from a different angle to what had, you know, up until now been almost normative. I mean, there's an entire industry, for example, around Jack the Ripper. I'm here in London. There are people going on tours, Jack the Ripper tours. I mean, very tasteful tours, no doubt. I'm just curious that presumably if you weren't in consultation, what do you think the reason has been that for so long in these crime stories that male violence has been, what word would you use? Centered is one way, idealized, romanticized, and why do you feel
the focus? Yeah.
And do you feel that now, I mean, both of you have chosen to come at stories from an angle that, you know, doesn't center those men in that way, or male violence in that way. What's the tide that's has something changed in the culture, do you think, that has made that possible for those alternative perspectives to be heard?
I think one of the things fundamentally that I think true crime is about and supports the notion of is the concept of the male hero pursuing the male villain, and the male hero making the world safe. So it's always about the cop going after the killer, the cop solving the mystery, the lawyer bringing the killer to justice. Quite often, the women are at the margins. The women are the victims. The women, you know, the grieving sweetheart, or, you know, the femme fatale, who just happens to get caught up in something. You know, and so this is about a kind of male ownership of the world, and I think it's interesting because, I mean, as far as true crime is concerned, you know, and what we know about true crime is that the audience for true crime is largely women, which I think is very interesting. And perhaps these audiences and these readers are now willing to hear a broader perspective on this, that it shouldn't just be male hero pursuing male villain. And, you know, but it should be about other things. But also I think it's a tired narrative, and I think it needs to be challenged. And I think that's certainly what I set out to do, that there are the other sides of the story of a murder that should be examined.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I guess just to point out the obvious, the composition of this panel would have been quite novel 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It is a remarkably, not just at the level of story, but at the level of authorship, male-dominated genre. And one of the things that surprised me, so Harper Lee had tried to write a book about the case that's at the heart of my book, and she followed the case in the 1970s, and she had helped Capote writing Cold Blood in the 1960s. And over again, people who talked to me about her research and reporting, you know, marveled at the fact they couldn't believe, you know, a nice small town girl was interviewing murderers. and that she was going door to door, or that she was meeting with coroners. There was this sense that, you know, a nice Southern lady would not have pursued a murder story, and that this kind of reporting was not appropriate for women. And I think when you go back through the archives of true crime reporting, you can find the Zora Neale Hurstons. You know, you can find these one-off trials where unexpected reporters gain access or are able to tell the stories. But I just think, you know, it's so self-evident to me that we are here having this conversation, and the kinds of stories we tell are different than what the men several generations ago would have. So we're inheritors of opportunity and access, and, you know, just the ways the industry has opened up to us. It feels obvious to me that Hallie's going to pursue different stories than her male colleagues would, or that, you know, I would bring a different lens to the same kinds of murder stories that, you know, people were interested in my case in the 1970s, but the versions of the events they produced are radically different than mine.
Absolutely. That's one thing that I found that's so interesting, is when you read these narratives, you know, in the 1930s, they will have a different way of talking about Jack the Ripper than they did in the 1960s. Somehow it becomes very sexualized in the 60s. In the 70s, it becomes very wrapped up in conspiracy theory. And, you know, so you know, we use different lenses at different times to reflect what our society is particularly concerned with and particularly interested in. I would hope that a feminist perspective is not just a kind of passing phase, but something which will be more integrated into how we examine crime in the future as well.
It's interesting to me that in, you know, media stories around crime, women, female criminals, particularly female murderers, are usually presented as mad rather than bad. You know, the whole mad, bad. The men are sort of intrinsically evil, and women, you know, are obviously intrinsically good people. So it must be some form of temporary madness. And I'm just wondering to what extent some of these mythologies around femininity and masculinity have been at the heart of the way in which true crime stories have been told until now. And is there just more space culturally now for an expansion of what we think of as those categories which have for a long time been straitjackets?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, Casey, please jump in, because I don't want to dominate here. I'll give you a chance.
You should answer that, and then I'll speak to something kind of specific about my case. But I think that your book is a little more relevant to this question.
About how we, the way in which, I mean, certainly I have read the Jack the Ripper narrative traditionally is, you know, the five victims have been marginalized, but not only have they been marginalized, they've been demonized as well, you know. So, you know, again, you know, if you look at murderers and you see, you know, usually like a woman like, for example, Lizzie Borden is being seen as not necessarily evil, but just deranged, whereas men are seen as evil malefactors. And I think victims, often women, female victims of murders, one of the first questions that seems to be asked is, you know, what did she do to deserve it? There's a lot of victim blaming. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, the kind of sexualization of the Ripper victims, I mean, certainly within their own period, it's a way of almost justifying their murder. Well, they were asking for it. It's very interesting. Again, it's the same with research I'm looking at now into the Crippen murder. Belle Elmore, Crippen's wife, who he murdered, you know, there was a lot of discussion about whether, you know, she pushed him to kill her because she was a nagging, henpecking, very bolshy, brassy woman. And so naturally, you know, there must have been something so wrong that the man had to kill her. And you know, it's interesting how we see this echoed in so much from even today. I mean, it's extraordinary. There was, and now I've forgotten exactly the name of the woman in Russia. There was a student who was killed by her. He was her PhD supervisor. They were historians, and you know, and as soon as the story broke, you know, it was all about how he was found dropping her body in the river in pieces, and you know what she had done to deserve this. We see this all the time. We see this in cases of women who've been raped, like the Chantel Miller case by Brock Turner, who sexually assaulted her. You know, what was she doing? What did, you know, she was drunk at a party, therefore she made him do it. This hasn't changed. It's still with us. And it's something which needs to be addressed. And we need to think about why it is we ask this question, that, you know, somehow women are pushing men to commit crimes against them.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, I think that we're engaged in a serious conversation, and an appropriate one, about gender. And I know from Hallie's book too, socioeconomic status, about who is a legitimate victim and whose stories deserve to be told. And I think the only other thing I would say is, you know, with regard to my book, one of the most interesting things about Harper Lee's interest in this case is the crime story. Part of my book is an African-American preacher accused of killing several of his family members. So, you know, in today's parlance, black on black crime. And it was a surprising choice for her. Came with a lot of cultural baggage already in the 70s, and only more so today. And I think that in addition to gender and socioeconomic status, there's this question of, especially in the American context, about race and whose stories are told, or whose stories are pathologized in a certain sense. And I think that was another kind of cultural expectation I felt like I had to deal with head on, both about the kinds of stories we lift up as emblematic or representative, or the pathologies ascribed to a murderer. And again, thinking about who is invited to tell these crime stories and what access they're given or authority they're given. And I think that, you know, I tell the story in the book, and I wrote something longer about it more recently, but it's absolutely staggering to me to go and look at James Baldwin's reporting on the Atlanta child murders, for instance, and to look at the authority and the knowledge and the perspective he brought to that case, which, you know, like Jack the Ripper, had been covered over and over and over again. And, you know, white writer after white writer had come to the city of Atlanta and imposed a certain story and extracted a certain kind of meaning. And Baldwin came with fresh eyes and his authentic perspective and wrote incredibly about that case. So I do just feel like one of the reasons it's such an interesting time, it's not just, Myriam, as you've said, kind of alternative structures or, you know, themes we bring to these stories. It's just a wonderful time because there are more and more people writing true crime. It is not all straight white men pursuing the stories of interest to them.
Well, that's a really neat segue into my next question, actually, which was what drew you to the genre, right? Because obviously, if it is a genre that has been dominated and has been, in fact, for so long by, you know, the pale, stale male perspective, what made you sort of, both of you sort of think, oh, okay, let me approach this, let me take this on, and was it motivated by a desire to kind of, you know, hold on, let me set you straight, or was it motivated by, you know, a love of the genre in itself?
I think I approached this not even coming at it as wanting to write true crime, but coming at it as wanting to give voice to working class women whose voices are never, ever heard. And a way of finding working class women who would kind of, I mean, first of all, well, I approached it thinking I wanted to tell the story about sex workers and sex workers' lives and working class sex workers' lives in the past. And my first instinct was, well, who are the best known 19th century sex workers? And my first instinct was, well, that would be the victims of Jack the Ripper. And of course, then I started this investigation. And then what I found was actually 3 of the 5, I could find no hard evidence whatsoever that they were involved in the sex trade, which I found really surprising, which then really sort of led on to a series of other questions which I asked, which was, well, why is it that we have assumed this? And how had society set them up to be portrayed this way? And, you know, why? Why was it so important? And again, this comes back to the demonization of women and, you know, the creating of boundaries and roles and norms for women of that class. And so that's actually, you know, that's what drew me in, and that's one of the things that I discovered. But also that's one of the really, really interesting things about, I think, taking on a true crime subject, because I think true crime, you can take a crime and the crime can tell you something spectacular about a time and a place, and it can tell you about the people. It's like doing a core sample of a time and a place, and you look at it and you can pick it apart and you can see, well, what were the society's mores, what were the values, what, you know, a society creates a killer, and that same society creates a victim. So what was going on? What warning lights was the society just kind of bypassing entirely to allow the killer to become the killer and the victim to become the victim? And I think those are really fascinating questions.
Absolutely. Casey, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, although you know, it's a funny question about my book and, you know, my intentions, which I think, like a lot of writers, the intention is always just to sort of figure out what happened and follow a narrative thread where it goes. And, you know,
why that story in particular, though?
Yeah, so I was going to say, I mean, the beginning of my book is, as far as true crime stories go, kind of surprising, because it starts with the creation of a hydroelectric dam and, you know, the flooding of a riverbed and the relocation of a lot of people in eastern Alabama. So one of these, probably folks know the TVA and the Tennessee Valley Authority and those projects, but there were other private versions of that, and the Alabama Power Company flooded this river and made a dam. And, you know, when I first heard that story, I was down there reporting and I thought, it's Genesis. You know, this is a story about a flood, and it happened around the time that the accused murderer in my book was born. And, you know, the area where he grew up was radically changed by this. And so the idea that crime stories, we have to go looking for them, or that they're not embedded in our lives. I mean, unfortunately, they're incredibly common, and not always violent crime, but often our experience of life, people we love are harmed or injured, or their ambitions are thwarted. And, you know, for me, I think it's so possible to fetishize the idea certain crimes happen to certain people, or to look around and pretend that we will only ever be consumers of these things. When I looked at that river and at that lake, it's this huge man-made lake today. And so the book opens in that way because it feels to me like this is what it means to be human. And unfortunately, it means following these things in the news, or hearing that they've happened to someone we loved, or wondering why they happened to other people. And so to me, it just feels like it's another part of life, like having children. You know, it really is, it's our obligation to think about why it happens, and to offer sympathy to those who it does happen to, or to understand, you know, what's going on in the world and why we treat each other this way. So yeah, I think that sometimes that kind of abstraction of like thinking we only come to these stories as writers and not as people, and that the things that happened in the past when it comes to true crime are still happening today. I appreciate Hallie lifting up, you know, equivalent stories around the world right now, where it's not some grave failure of the past that they sensationalize violence in their own lives, or they neglected statistically significant crimes. I mean, it's happening right now. You know, tax fraud should be the #1 story we're talking about in this country. You know, it is a crime story that we're not telling, and we're not telling thoroughly. And, you know, or around the world, the plight of, you know, trafficked women. There are just stories over and over again. It's not a failure of the past. So I think that in that sense, it both, you know, I didn't set out to write a true crime book, but it feels obvious to me that if you are writing a true story, unfortunately, no one's lives are untouched by this, even in the broad cultural sense. This is the world we live in. So yeah, I was letting Hallie answer because I feel she has a better answer and a more genre specific answer, because I kind of scratch my head and think, well, it goes back to Genesis. And if we're honest about the communities we live in and the cultural context we inhabit, it's our obligation to think about these cases and to make sense of them, and to, in some ways, be there for people who have lived through them, or who did and were neglected in their suffering.
It's the humanizing of crime. I think that's so important. You know, you said, you know, that's one of the things you mentioned. I felt that extremely strongly when I was writing this, was that it is so important to inject the human element back into these stories, which are so sensationalist and are so sensationalist that they can feel fictionalized. And we have to keep pulling ourselves back in and reminding us these killers were human beings, and these things happen to human beings, and they happen not only to the victim but to their families. And that, you know, that isn't something we should forget about. And I think quite often that's glossed over in our interest in true crime. You know, I think, you know, there are different levels of interest in true crime. And I think a lot of people are very interested in the whodunit. A lot of people are very interested in the criminological aspects of this and understanding the criminal mind. You know, what makes a human being do harm to another human being? I think that's an incredibly valid question, and it should be explored. It's worthy of being explored, but I think not necessarily to the exclusion of everything else that we can extrapolate from an examination of that material. You know, at the heart of every crime is a profound human interest story. And I think we need to really kind of take deep dives into that too.
So pulling up on both of those points, I mean, Casey, you talked about the idea that, you know, no one can not be impacted by these stories because they're true stories. And ultimately, if there is an imbalance in the narrative, then that is an imbalance that affects, you know, everyone. And if it's an imbalance as regards the stories around women, then it particularly impacts us. And I guess, Hallie, in particular, in your story, obviously, the idea of censoring the stories of working class women who were victims has been perceived by some people as a feminist stance. Do either of you regard yourselves as feminist authors? Is that a term that you identify with? Is it one that you think is a necessary qualifier, or do you reject it?
I mean, I feel, interestingly, as a historian, I've been extremely hesitant to give myself a label, because I think the moment you give yourself a label, you approach your material with a bias. And I don't ever want to approach my material with a bias. I also think it's very interesting that just because I'm writing about women, that I am given the label of a feminist. I mean, of course, I am a feminist. I do believe in feminism, but what I would like to do is separate that aspect from whatever it is I'm looking at. I mean, I try wherever possible to go in and examine the material with a completely fresh and unbiased as much as I possibly can, because we all carry biases with us. You know, and look at the material for what it is, because that's what a responsible and good historian does, and that's certainly what I try to do. I think it's inevitable that a woman writing about women is called a feminist writer these days. It's almost unavoidable.
Casey?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I appreciate doing this with Hallie. I write about politics, and I've written explicitly. I wrote a piece for the New Yorker. There was a review of some books about anger, and many of them had a kind of feminist bent and were narrating the experience of women's anger in the political sphere. But it's kind of a curious thing. I don't know if I've ever been put on the spot to identify as feminist or not. But, you know, I guess what I would say is I really regret the extent to which that question or others like it have become politicized. And, you know, I think, unfortunately, the spirit in which that question is asked more often than not, you didn't mean it this way, Myriam, but it's asked as a kind of gotcha. And to Hallie's point, it somehow reveals your bias or your agenda. And that feels really grievous to me, because its heart, feminism, of course, is asserting equal rights of everyone.
Right. Yeah. So that's definitely where the question was situated.
Right. Exactly.
I hear you asking it in a completely generous spirit, and acknowledging the particularities of our work, you know, writing about female victims, writing about a female novelist and her experience in mid-century America. But, you know, to me, it's so unfortunate. It's like all the other values that are important to me. You know, when someone says, are you a Christian or not? Unfortunately, more often than not today, they mean, are you a hypocrite? And if they ask, you know, are you a liberal? They're asking in some kind of pejorative spirit. And I guess I just lament that so many of the kind of foundational values to me just feel like gotchas now, and that we approach each other with this hostility and suspicion. And that's not about this panel, it's not about this book festival. I'm sure we come in a spirit of generosity and hope and excitement about inquiry and the beauty of what books can teach us. But yeah, somehow it does feel kind of depressing to me that we go around with these kind of litmus tests for people of, are you this, are you that? And even people who should be allies and in agreement with us go around policing these labels. So I certainly appreciate, especially Hallie, with your book, I know that you have been met with hostility and animosity by people who should be fellow travelers, who might have a different interpretation, but it feels grievous to me that we just come at each other with just foundational hostility. So I don't know if it matters or not, but of course I would say I'm a feminist, I'm a humanist, I'm a Christian. I believe that we all bear the image of God and should treat each other with respect. So it doesn't feel controversial to me, but I know the world we live in. And again, Hallie, I know the world you occupy with your book, and I can appreciate why you're careful. And, labels are unfortunately not a way we look for affinities any longer. They're ways we look for division and hostility. Exactly. So yeah, what a curious time, and I hope one we're moving through, not deeper into.
Yeah.
Yes. And on that note, I will turn to our audience who do have a load of questions for you ladies. One that I would like to put to you first is from Andre, who says, I think it's fascinating to examine true crimes from a female perspective and to deviate from a male-dominated discourse, often white, that focuses only the violence of a murder. Do you think that the general climate now, which has been calling for the social justice of historically marginalized peoples and communities, will, one, help encourage more diverse voices to emerge in the genre, and two, that there will be more people interested in perhaps retelling older classic stories in a fresher way?
I think it's happening already. I think people are very interested in retelling classic stories in from a different perspective, and I absolutely applaud that. I think it's necessary, as I think it is completely necessary to look for where those marginalized voices are and to reach out and completely incorporate them into the canon, whatever the canon is, to expand that canon. Because if we are, especially as a historian, part of what we do is, this aggrandizes it a bit, but we're questing for truth. And, if you're constantly looking to reassess what it is that truth is, you have to look very broadly, and you have to incorporate things which you have to, look critically at your own time and the time that you came from, and see where the deficiencies are. And the deficiencies are very clear. The deficiencies are, we have not heard most of the stories that we need to be hearing. We have silenced people. We have silenced the poor. We have silenced people of color. We have silenced women. We have silenced anybody who is not of an elite. And yes, absolutely, those stories must be incorporated.
Yeah, I think Hallie's absolutely right, and I'm glad to see it at a broad cultural level. I just want to say, with regard to the story at the heart of my book, for folks who've read it, there's the crime story culminates in the murder of the murderer, and the second part of the book is about the trial of the vigilante. And anyway, that man's name is Robert Burns, and Robert is still alive, and Robert is working with a niece of his to write his own memoirs and to tell his own story. And his story has been told by me, by other white reporters, by a few Black writers who covered the story at the time. But Robert is now working on his memoirs and wants to bring to life all the years of his life that weren't the year of that murder. And there's a survivor, there's a widow of one of the victims in my book who wrote a novel about her late husband. And that proliferation around even just this one case, it is really people who for 40 years have lived with these crimes but never felt like they could tell their own story. And I just think that is representative of the broader trends. And I think that, you know, it's not just race and gender. I'm glad, again, we're talking about class, because I started with the story of, you know, the flooding of Lake Martin, and that is a crime story of its own kind. You know, communities were flooded. A few people got very rich from this hydroelectric power plant, but for a long time that was just, you know, a natural history story we told. And of course, it's a crime story. Certain people got rich off of a public river, you know, a river that was owned by all of the people of Alabama, that was dammed, redirected. And so I think thinking broadly about, you know, as Hallie said, you know, working class people, about the economically marginalized, and, you know, people whose stories weren't told. They were never acknowledged as violent or brutal or exploitative. And I think that that's a project that has to go all the way back in time, but I hope it's one we're engaged in at this very moment and in the future. That, you know, why wait 100 years to go back and hear the story we missed? I hope today that we're just lifting up the experiences of more people and listening to the marginalized and trying to right those injustices now, not in a revisionist project 100 years later.
Yeah, we would definitely hope in the years to come that that project you're undertaking isn't as necessary, right? Because those voices won't have been suppressed. I'll leave a question mark though over that one personally. Yeah. Cami is wondering, how does the research and writing of your book alter your initial perspective that you bring to the topic or crime?
So how does the research,
how does the research and writing of your book alter your initial perspective that you bring to the topic of crime? It's an interesting one for me as well. I mean, you know, as a lay writer, not in your league, ladies, certainly. But yeah, so of course, any topic you choose to come to, you probably have a sense of what it is that you think you're looking at, right? So yeah. how does the research, and particularly the depth of research that you ladies have had to do for your books, change your initial perspective, or, you know, or does it confirm it?
I try to go in with very few expectations. So I haven't, I mean, when you're writing, for example, when you're submitting a proposal for a nonfiction book, you have to do preliminary research to put together a proposal. And almost always the actual book is very different from the proposal, because you haven't done the research yet. And so there's this whole process of readjustment. I try not to have too many expectations, but you seem, you know, from what you read, usually you do a big survey of all of the secondary source material, and you read what other people have written, and invariably people will bring their perspectives. I mean, I'm thinking particularly about the book I'm writing now. I mean, anybody who's written about Crippen are men, and they write it from totally a male perspective. Mm-hmm. And already just looking at the material, I can see how that completely diverges if you start looking at the female experience of this. And so that it's a perspective shift. So yeah, what you set out to do and what you end up with are two totally different things. So, I mean, I hope I've managed to address that question sufficiently.
Yeah, totally. Cami, you'll let us know if not. Casey, what about yourself?
I mean, I think that's a great question for writers, but it's also just a great question for human beings, meaning, you know, you make assumptions about someone in the grocery store line or at the post office, and then you learn something about how complex their life is, and that's why they're rude or they butt in front of you. And, you know, I think epistemological humility about other people and about the circumstances of their lives is just foundational to being a good writer and a good person. And I think that, you know, in crime, Hallie's already said this, but the convention is to choose a hero and to choose a villain and plot their lives accordingly. And, you know, that just crumbles. There's no one who's completely saintly, and there's no one who's completely criminal. And, you know, the surprises that come from research and, you know, the shocking facts that emerge about people you thought were good or people you thought were bad, I think is really what makes reporting interesting. And you know, levels everyone to a certain extent.
And we have to get away from the binary concept of heroes and villains, because everybody has a bit of the hero and the villain in them. And I think we want to paint heroes and villains and we can't.
Would it be the case that some people are allowed to be both hero and villain and some people are only allowed to be one shade? I'm just thinking particularly when it comes to women, sex work, you know, usually indicts you fairly quickly to the category of non-hero.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, promiscuity associated with money in men is rarely considered a defining point when it comes to a character flaw. But yes, we have only 1 minute to go, I'm afraid. So I'm going to have to wrap up. Thank you so much to both of you. Thanks to the speakers. Thank you for all of you joining us at home today. Thank you for tuning in. Before I go, I'd like to point out that the Baillie Gifford Prize page in the literary marketplace on the Brooklyn Book Festival website has got loads of interesting books for you to check out. Go and have a look there. Thank you all again. Thank you, Hallie. Thank you, Casey. Thank you to the team that made this happen today, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of your weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Much.